It's great to be here with you guys, seriously. Jason and I met, what was it, 3-4 months ago?
Yeah.
Over Christmas break, and he invited me to come. He has no idea whether I can speak. He barely knows what I'm going to talk about, so this is probably the worst introduction to a speaker ever, but there you go. But it's great to be here. It's funny, I kind of Facebook stalked you guys' page a little bit, and I feel a little unqualified to be here because it seemed like all the talks I saw were like guys in suits and professors, and I think your last talk was about, what was it, quantum physics or something?
Something like
this
that.
isn't going to be that intelligent, so it's not going to be quite that heady, but hopefully we'll all get something out of it. But I was actually I was a student here from 96 to 2000, industrial engineering, which I think we still have the #1 IE school in the country, don't we?
Yeah.
And yet we have the worst buildings on campus, which blows my mind. And yet mechanical engineering has still the most amazing facilities ever. I don't get that, but not anything you guys can do about it. I have the rare distinction of having been booted from 2 fraternities. I'm actually on a composite wall of 2 separate houses on this campus. I'm not going to tell you what they were, but they're there if you want to go seek them out. I didn't do anything bad. I didn't do drugs or anything, but I didn't take it seriously enough. So, which was a fair reason. Yeah, I don't know. My time at Tech was kind of weird. You get here and you kind of realize that there's 2 kinds of students here. There's the naturally brilliant students, and then that wasn't the kind that I was. I was the kid that had to sit in the library for like 12 hours a day and constantly study. Like a lot of stuff just didn't make sense to me, and a lot of times I felt very out of place here, as I think a lot of people do. But it was a great school. I'm really proud of my degree. I don't know if it's funny talking to alumni now, you look back on it and half the people loved it and half the people hated it, but everybody's really proud of their degree. And I will tell you this, 10, 15 years from now, you will still be having nightmares about it. Just get ready for that. I think I have the same one every couple weeks, but the reason I'm here is because I have an addiction to movies and the art of storytelling. And that's what I'm going to talk to you guys about tonight. Oh, you've heard of movies. Oh, great. But I did. If you walk in my house, I have a monument to wasted money on Blu-rays and DVDs. It's ridiculous. I've got books on film strewn about the den. I've got this just started. This was just an obsession that started when I was a kid. I've got framed movie posters all over my house. When I was 8 years old, I memorized Back to the Future and would recite it for people. I don't mean like a scene. I mean like the whole movie. Like from start to finish, I could literally recite the whole movie, and it drove people crazy. I would camp out for movie tickets. Actually, I got to tell a story about that. It's not totally related to any of this, but you heard of Star Wars, right? Okay.
Wait, what's that?
Yeah. So 1999, when you guys were 5, Episode 1's coming out. They're going to make another Star Wars. Now, this is before we, knew that it was going to suck and George Lucas was going to destroy our childhoods, but we were all super excited. This is going to be amazing, a new Star Wars. Now, the thing about back then was that being dorky wasn't cool like it is now. Like, now you just like, oh, you're wearing a Captain America shirt, cool. Like, that wasn't cool back then. Like, Star Wars wasn't really synonymous with chick magnet at the time. So you didn't open up with that when you were talking to a girl or, I don't know, maybe you would think that's cool, I don't know, but most women didn't. So some friends call me, the tickets go on sale 2 weeks ahead of time, and some friends call me and they're like, dude, we're going to camp out for Star Wars tickets. And part of my brain's thinking, oh, sweet, yeah, of course we are. This is going to be great. And then the other part of me that wanted to have a girlfriend one day said, you can do this, but you can't tell people about it. Like, this wouldn't go over well. So we take a drive up to the theater. We camp out the night before, wake up the next morning, and as far as the eye can see, just Star Wars dorks with lightsabers and Wookiee outfits, and we fit in perfect. It's amazing. And at the time, I'm like, this is fun, but I still don't want to tell people about this. Well, a couple hours later, news crews start to show up because this was a huge deal. This was like 9/11 huge. Okay, that's probably not the best reference, but this was a big thing. Like, people were making a huge deal out of this. So news crews are showing up. And at that point, I'm thinking, well, news crews broadcast things like across the city. This isn't good because I don't want people to know I'm doing this. But I exaggerate not when I say they bypassed probably 100 people and went straight to me and my friends. So next thing I know, there's a camera in my face that may or may not be broadcast across Atlanta that I'm camping out for Star Wars tickets. as I start to interview us, one of my friends tells the camera that I love to have lightsaber battles, and then I have a big crush on Princess Leia. And I'm like, oh, damn, this isn't good. But then I'm thinking, well, they're probably not going to use this. Like, there's a lot of... 3 hours later, I start getting texts from people that my face was across the 5:30 news being told how much I loved to have lightsaber battles. So it was humiliating. But you know what? It was worth it because I love movies. So about 10 years ago, I started a career in screenwriting. And really all it was I was a couple of friends, and we just started trying our hand at writing scripts. And we didn't really know what we were doing. If you look at, first off, if you ever have a kid and they want to be a screenwriter, dissuade them from that. It's the most soul-crushing career ever. It's brutal in so many ways, but if you can get in that small 0.01% that makes it, it's a really amazing field to pursue. But I think on average, the average screenwriter writes for 10 years before they actually make any money doing it. And we got really fortunate. We're really blessed in a lot of ways, and we actually had our second script optioned by Lionsgate Films. We got to go out to LA, got to meet a bunch of people. It was awesome. We kind of, for a couple of days, became these mini celebrities. We were on radio shows, and we were on the front page of the AJC living section. This is back when they had newspapers. But it was great. It was really cool. The film actually ended up getting purchased by a production company here in Atlanta. It got made, and I'm not telling you the name of it because they did a lot of things to it I wasn't thrilled with, and I'm kind of an indignant artist in that regard. But you can probably IMDb it and look it up. So I should probably whatever. But it was a lot of fun. 3 years ago, we started a production company called the Brothers Ray Production Company, and we made a short film that got into several film festivals. We got to go to Comic-Con, the Comic-Con Film Festival. We won several awards. We just finished shooting another one. I don't tell you all this to tell you about all my unimpressive accomplishments, but I tell you just to tell you my background and my recent career has been screenwriting and storytelling. At which point you're probably wondering, why am I not talking to the Screenwriting Club instead of the Christian Apologetics Club? But this actually has a tie into faith and worldview, and that's kind of what I want to talk about tonight. There's kind of a misconception about screenwriting, which is that, and I had it before I started doing it, which is that it's just a purely creative venture. Like you're taking a shower one day and all of a sudden this idea hits you and it's a great story and you just throw it down and it's genius and it goes out like that. That's not how it works at all. There is just as much of a science to screenwriting as there is an art. And that's what's kind of weird about it. The thing I would probably compare it to the most would be architecture. So in architecture, you build a building and it's got to be functional, right? It's got to stand up. You can't walk into it and it crumbles. I mean, you have to be able to walk up and down the stairs. You have to be able to open doors. You have to be able to do things with it. It has a very rigid structure to it. But at the same time, how beautiful and wonderful you make it, it has an artistic side to it too. You can make a totally functional building. It's boring and stupid, and it doesn't really do anything. There's no beauty to it. And that's kind of how screenwriting works. It's very much a balance of those two things. To me, when I first started learning that seemed really counterintuitive to me because it's like, well, it's an art. I mean, you're creating. It seems odd to me that you would have to follow these rules. I mean, when somebody's painting a picture, they're not told, well, you have to make the brush go this way, or when you write a song, you're not told that you have to make the note here. That just seemed odd to me. Well, the difference between that and other art forms is that it has story involved with it. And the key point here is that story structure matters because how we perceive and experience stories very much relates to how we perceive and experience real life. So if I write a script and I take it to a studio, the very first thing they're going to do is look and see if I follow a very specific type of structure. They're going to want to know if I introduce all my characters by page 10. And when I say page 10, I mean specifically these pages. I have to put my character in a terrible situation by page 30. I have to get him out of it by page 90. And I can't go over 110 pages. So there are very specific beats you have to hit. There are midpoints and ups and downs and resolutions you have to hit, and that's the scientific part of it. I'll give you kind of an example of this. The most famous structure that pretty much every movie you've ever seen follows is the 3-act structure. Does anybody know what this is, 3-act structure? Okay, I'll give you a brief review of it anyway. So think of the original Star Wars trilogy. We'll go back to Star Wars again. Star Wars A New Hope, you meet a bunch of characters. Empire Strikes Back, and we throw these characters in the worst possible situation. Oh my gosh, how are they going to get out of it? Return of the Jedi, they get out of it. So it's introduction, it's conflict, it's resolution. Now the reason that matters is because that is essentially the pattern your life takes over and over and over again. That's what you do. That's what you go through. You went through that probably 100 times today. You encountered a situation, you had a conflict, it got resolved. Maybe it didn't get resolved well, but it got resolved. So that's the pattern you see over and over and over again. And that's essentially what a narrative is. It's a pattern or a story through which we set our expectations about reality. So I want to talk a little bit more about narrative and just what it is exactly. I mean, essentially your narrative, you have narratives of how the world works. And for the most part, they're based on the accumulation of your experiences. I'll give you a good example of this. So I grew up in Atlanta, and I'm a huge Braves fan, Falcons fan, Hawks fan. Being an Atlanta fan has been the most gut-wrenching experience year after year for me because my teams are just inevitably going to do something horrible. The worst possible thing is going to happen. My quarterback's going to get arrested for dogfighting. The head coach is going to just leave suddenly. I don't know, the whole team's plane will crash. I don't know, something's going to go horribly, horribly wrong. Well, who's the big team in Atlanta this year? The Hawks, right? The Hawks are amazing. I have got such an embedded narrative in my head of how Atlanta sports is going to go that not once have I even considered the possibility we're going to win a championship. And what's funny is most of my friends, and that's not cynicism, although I am a little bit cynical, but even my most positive friends, the most optimistic among us, they're just so used to it. I mean, they've lived this over and over and over again, and they've developed this story in their head about how Atlanta sports goes. That's just kind of how it works. We do this with stories, but we also do it with characters. So I worked at Walt Disney World for about 6 months. I did a couple of internships there in their industrial engineering department back in, I guess it was 98, 99. And the funny thing was I started to realize everybody had like a favorite Disney character. And there were insane parallels between that person's favorite Disney character and that person. And so I started to kind of like think about this, and I developed this like weird kind of theory about like, you can tell us so much about a person if all you know about them is their favorite Disney character. I was at a party a couple weeks ago and I tried this out. And people seriously thought that I had like done research on them beforehand. Like I'd hired a private detective because they would just tell me their favorite Disney character. I would tell them 10 things about themselves and they'd be like, what? Like they thought I'd met them before. It's weird, but it works. And the reason for that is because we start to see ourselves in these characters. And this works both ways. We see ourselves in our stories, and we see our stories in ourselves, and that's kind of how it works. But these things bleed into each other. Narrative and reality begin to bleed into each other, and they start to become intertwined. I think a lot of people have this perspective. I mean, you look at your life as a story, and you're the main character of that story. You're the protagonist. You have antagonists in your story. The professor who failed you, the guy who pissed you off the other day. You have a love interest in your story. The man or the woman comes into your life. Then that man or woman might become the antagonist, and then there's another one. And it's introduction, conflict, resolution, over and over and over again. And that's what we see in our stories. Now, getting more specific with worldviews, what we also see is that we start to define members of other worldviews to a certain extent. The atheist might look at the Christian and say, oh yeah, that's the guy who can't deal with reality and is really afraid of, they're like children and they hate science and they're really they're very judgmental. We do this with atheists. Oh, they're very anti-God, they're very bitter, they probably got abused as a kid and are just angry and lashing at everybody. This is kind of how what we do. We cast people as characters in our heads. And then we hijack words like rational and progressive and reason, and then we say they don't apply to the other side. We turn ourselves into the good guy, and then we turn the people that we're arguing with on the other side of the bad guy. We're the protagonist, they're the antagonist. And the tricky part of it is if you start your conversation applying everything through the narrative that you have preconceived, it just becomes incredibly difficult to have any sort of productive conversation with people. So there's 3 points I want to make about narrative real quick. Sorry, Chris. So there's 3 points I want to make. The first one is that everybody has a narrative through which they see the world. It does not matter who you are. It does not matter how unbiased you might think you are. You've got one. I've got one. Even though he doesn't think he does, Richard Dawkins has one. Sam Harris has one. All of these guys have one. Billy Graham has one. Everybody's got one, no matter what perspective they're coming to the world from. And the reason for that is because you're a human being. This is just psychologically how we work. This is why, on a deeper psychological level, studios understand the fact that they shouldn't make scripts that don't connect with people's narratives of the world. They understand that people do this. They understand the science of it. They get how it works. Let's take a very specific example. So, I don't know. When I was in college, nobody followed the news because everybody was too busy. So, I hope you guys remember the Michael Brown story in Ferguson, Missouri. Everybody remember this story? Okay. So, August 9th, 2014, a black teenager, Michael Brown, walking down the street in Ferguson, Missouri. A skirmish happens with the police. He ends up dead. I have no idea what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, but you know who knows what happened? Every single one of my friends on my Facebook feed. I could have gone down that list and everybody had an opinion on it before they even had the first clue what had happened. It was crazy. Facts had not come out yet, but it didn't matter. And the really funny thing about it was that I could, before the story even happened, go tell you what their narrative was going to be. Because I already knew what they thought about these things. I could predict, without even knowing what the issue was and what the facts were, what half my friends were going to say about it. And I was right. I mean, you could probably do this too. If an issue comes up, I don't know, Obamacare, or some political issue, abortion, I mean, take whatever you want, without ever even having talked to some of your friends about that particular issue, you can probably go down the list and see who thinks what about what. Politics, you know, and that's kind of how politics are. It's like, this explains why two otherwise totally rational people can look at the exact same thing and have completely different viewpoints on it. They have the exact same facts, they have the exact same evidence, the statistics are the same, none of that stuff matters. What matters is the narrative that they came into that situation with. So let's go to, narratives have a variety of different causes. Narratives are kind of a tricky thing to nail down because think about everything that makes you you, all the experiences you've gone through that nobody else understands or has ever gone through. It's essentially an accumulation. Taking it to worldviews, let's take an example. I remember reading a study not that long ago that made the comment that if you look at almost all of the major atheist thinkers throughout history, almost all of them had not just a bad relationship with their father, but a just borderline insane dysfunctional relationship with their father. And the argument was that, I think the argument's obvious, the argument was that, you know, having that experience painted their viewpoint on God before they had ever even really considered the question. Now, obviously, I'm not saying all atheists, you know, had a bad relationship with their father. There are plenty of atheists that had wonderful relationships with their father. But this applies to Christians too. I mean, think about, you know, you grow up and you go to a church and you're taught that God exists and you had this wonderful experience there. And then you get to college and people start attacking that viewpoint. Well, your narrative tells you, wait a second, no, that the thing you're attacking is representative of a world that I love, that I grew up in, that made me happy. My narrative tells me immediately that you're wrong. I don't know why you're wrong, but you just are. You've got to be, because I have good feelings coming into this that I tie to that worldview that you're attacking. Going back to Ferguson. I'm a white male who grew up in America. I have no idea what it is like to be a black person in America. It's impossible for me to say. I've never been racially profiled. I don't know what that's like. I don't know the struggles of what that's like to go through day to day. But somebody who has had to go through that, a person who did go through that, a person who has had unjust treatment at the hands of the police, how are they probably going to view the Ferguson situation? I mean, I think that's kind of obvious, and it's understandable. Of course they're going to view it that way. There's going to be a bent towards aligning it with the preconceived narrative that they had. If your parents were cops, and you have known nothing but wonderful cops throughout your life, and they're just amazing people, and they would never hurt anyone, and they're all about justice and whatever, your preconceived narrative is that you're probably going to side with the cops in that situation. And you know, the key point here is, like, none of it really has to do with the facts of what happened. It's just the biases that we bring into things because of the stories we formed in our head about how society and life work. Let's go to a little more controversial issue. You're debating an atheist, and you're trying to prove that Jesus rose from the dead. I don't know, just take a topic. And for some reason that you feel like the facts just are not penetrating that person's head. Well, what if you knew that that person grew up homosexual in a church that ridiculed them, ran them down, told them they were going to hell? What fact can you possibly tell that person that's going to make them think that Jesus is good, the church is right? There's nothing. Because at that point, it's not about facts, it's about narratives, and that's essentially what you're debating at that point. So, point 3. Holding on to a narrative can limit you from seeing greater truths about yourself. I'm going to use an example here, and I would ask that you don't get too wrapped up in the specifics of the example and just listen to the point, because I don't know what everybody's beliefs are coming in here about this particular topic. But creation, evolution. Let's take that one. So if you had asked me when I was 12 years old, I would have told you that the earth is 10,000 years old. I would have told you evolution's crazy. I would have told you that's ridiculous. Nobody ever even taught me this. It wasn't like my pastor was sitting up there grabbing the pulpit yelling that you have to believe the earth is 10,000 years. At some point, this became part of my worldview. I don't know why. I don't know how. It just happened to be swirling around the culture I was in, and I latched onto it at some point. And it just became linked with that. So in my head, if you started attacking the notion that the world was 10,000 years old, you might as well be attacking the idea that Jesus loves me and Christianity is true, and these things just all became linked together to me. That was my narrative. That's how I started to approach it. A mentor of mine, actually, I think you guys, he spoke to you, Pete Bikino. I remember talking to him one day, and I just assumed he believed the same thing. And I was always like, well, how do you reconcile that? I remember looking at me like, what are you talking about? Of course the earth is insanely old. And that blew my mind, because I'm like, but wait, you're a Christian. This totally contradicts my narrative of 10,000 years old Christianity. These things aren't compatible. And, he challenged me to start looking at this question a little bit differently, because I had almost made an idol out of this idea that is not specifically stated anywhere biblically, but in my head, it was like, this is just part of the deal. Like, I couldn't let go of that. Well, I started doing some reading on it, and I started to really look at this question. And I started, looking at some of these facts, like, the days in Genesis don't mean literal days. The idea of functional ontology versus, that's a whole other topic we could get into. But as I looked at it, I was like, wait a second, I don't know where I got this idea from. Like, it became part of my narrative. I'm not sure how. I didn't study it and come up with it intellectually, but it just became a part of it. And then when I started to look at it a little closer, what I started to see was this story I'm reading in Genesis looks eerily similar to the very thing that I used to kind of be uncomfortable with. The idea that the earth is really old. The idea that life came about as a series of processes. And you got to think, you're talking about a book that was written a few thousand years ago. And it was in a time where creation stories included things like a comet hit a turtle and the turtle threw up and that's how we got Earth. It was just weird, bizarre stuff that didn't make any sense and didn't have any basis. And I started to look at this book, and I'm thinking, there were 3 things that stood out to me. It's like, first off, it basically says man was made from dust. Man is made from the elements of the earth. And that's true. I mean, every element of your body can be found somewhere else on earth. We are essentially creatures that come out of the very matter that surrounds us. The second was that life came about as a process. And it seemed odd to me because I was like, if I'm writing a story about God, why wouldn't he just snap his fingers and everything's there? And I started to realize that's just not the nature of God. That's not how God works. That's not how we see him working biblically throughout the entire story. And yet you have this book, thousands of years ago, written, basically making the claim that no, life came about gradually. It slowly became a thing over a process, over a period of time. And then I started to look at it closer, and I started to see that the order of it, as it was described in Genesis, really matched pretty closely with what evolutionary theory would say. And so I'm looking at this, and I'm starting to think, well, I don't know. I mean, this is kind of odd. And my point here is not that the earth is not 10,000 years old or that evolution is true. That's not what I'm saying. The point I'm trying to make is that this thing that had become this obstacle for me, suddenly when I let it go, became this really affirming truth for me. And it was like, if I'm God and I've got to write a book, why would I not write it in a form of an analogy? Why would I not write it for people who aren't going to understand the concept of billions of years and natural selection and all that sort of thing? whether you're a theistic evolutionist or what is not really the point. The point is that when I opened my eyes a little bit and I let go of that narrative, I started to see some things that could kind of confirm some other things. And these things, instead of becoming a weakness or an obstacle or something I had to beat my head against, like, well, how am I going to explain that? It actually started to be more of a confirming truth for me, and it was kind of an eye-opening experience. So those are the 3 points I wanted to make about narrative. To give you guys a brief rundown of my story real quick. So I grew up in a Southern Baptist church. I lived in Norcross, Duluth area. I pretty much lived in Atlanta most of my life, and I went through this really long period of faith questioning, where my faith kind of went away. And I didn't really know what I was for a while. I didn't know if I was an agnostic. I didn't know if I was an atheist. I didn't know if I didn't know. I wasn't sure anymore. What was odd about it happened I guess it was my senior year in high school. I was playing a basketball game. Because, that's when you have life-changing revelations. But I was playing a basketball game, and all of a sudden it hit me. I was like, what if none of this is true? It hit me out of nowhere. It made no sense, but it just suddenly hit me. What if none of this is true? And the next week I went to church, and none of it felt the same to me anymore. And all of a sudden, people would say, well, God, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, how do you know there's a God? And people would say, read your Bible. I'm like, how do you know that this is even legit? Like, how do we know any of this is true? And the thing that really drove me crazy about it was that it was almost like I started to view the world as like a forensic crime scene, where, let's say we found a body in the street, and all of a sudden I'm realizing there's this body in the street. I've always been told it got there one way, but what if it didn't get there that way? What if it got there another way? What if there's a totally different cause to all this that is just not congruent with what I've always been taught? And what really drove me crazy was none of the people around me seemed to have this problem. Like, this had just hit me out of nowhere. Like, for some reason, I was the only one who was troubled by this. I was the only one who was asking these questions. I didn't have like an apologetics group like this at the time to go to and really, voice these things. And even in the culture I grew up in, it was kind of like, well, you don't really, just take it on faith. It's just probably true, whatever. And that's kind of how people approach things. And what drove me even crazier was, this was in the early days of the internet. So, we were kind of just getting there at the time. But as that knowledge became more available, what I also noticed was it seemed like the people who were, kind of on the other side, the atheists, were immersed in these questions deeply. Like, they were talking about it, they were thinking about it, and the narrative that I started to form in my head was atheist equals smart, Christian equals stupid. That's the narrative that formed in my head. That's how I started to think about it. I wanted to be in the smart crowd. That's where I wanted to be. I was, I didn't, as much as I wanted this thing to be true, I didn't want to have to turn my brain off to believe it. At the time, the reason I tell you that is if you had talked to me then and you had been a Christian and you wanted to convince me that Christianity was real, it was not a matter of facts. It was not a fact you could have given me. It was not an issue of, well, I don't know if Genesis is real, or I don't know if Jesus really lived, or I don't know if the Big Bang, blah, blah, blah. That wasn't the issue. The issue was I had started creating this narrative in my head that you just could not penetrate, because that's just not what I was seeing. I was seeing a very intellectual group and a very not-so-intellectual group, and that started to sway my worldview a certain direction. Well, the first big shift I had in that was actually in a chemistry class at Tech, and I remember there was this brilliant woman, I can't even remember her name, but she was a scientist, pretty much someone you would expect to be in the smart crowd. And she was talking about the concept of entropy and the concept of disorder and things breaking down. And it was so bizarre because all of a sudden she starts to talk about, she said, well, these concepts raise a lot of questions for scientists in terms of how something could naturally order itself when the laws say it. And I know the argument for and against entropy, I'm not trying to start that argument, but what she said was, for answers to questions like that, we have to look to spiritual areas. We have to start to look at religion. And at first I didn't think I heard her right. I was like, you're in the smart crowd. Like, why? You're not supposed to say that. It was bizarre to me. And that was the first dent in that narrative I had, where I was seeing a brilliant scientist who had probably looked at these questions way more intensely than I had, actually cracking the door open a little bit for faith and for Christianity and for worldviews other than atheism. As the years went on, so really amazing people and books and reading material and stuff started entering my life and just kept chipping away at that worldview or at that narrative that I had, that had hardened around me. As it did, it was really life-changing for me. My faith came back. My faith was driven. It's a very different faith now. I'm still very much a Christian, but my views on things are a lot different because I am constantly in a state of trying to question my own assumptions and trying to break through the narratives and the preconceived notions that I have about things, which was a concept that was totally foreign to me at one time. So you go back to that analogy of a body in the street. An atheist approaches that body and says, I'm not going to consider any other alternative right now, but that got there naturally. A Christian approaches that body and says, no, this had to have been something outside. This had to have been an intelligence or a supernatural cause. Either one of those forensic investigators would be fired from the job immediately for not considering something else. If a detective walks up, he has to consider all sides, but that becomes tough to do when you enter these situations with a preconceived narrative. And that's where narratives are living, and narratives make that really hard to do. When I finally looked at that body without making those assumptions, that's when I felt like my eyes started to open a little bit, and I could see this. I could see the other side. I could understand, even if somebody agreed with me, why they disagree with me. So this may not be your experience. This was mine. I got to a point where, it can be frustrating as a Christian sometimes to, be labeled as the ignorant one or the unintelligent one, especially when you've spent so much time examining and reading and studying and really trying to come to terms with these questions as an intellectually honest way as possible. But ultimately for me, I rejected atheism because I just didn't think it made a very good argument. It wasn't because I was afraid of anything. It wasn't because I needed to believe in Santa Claus. It didn't have anything to do with that. I just thought the argument was very weak. I felt like Christianity made a better explanation for the world I saw around me than atheism did. So there's one narrative I want to talk about in particular, and then I'll start to close this out a little bit. But there is a narrative that I hear a lot that is really frustrating, and it's the idea of the unbiased, proven worldview. And if you're on your, I don't know where you guys are at in your faith. I don't know if any of you are atheists or Christian. I don't know. But if you're on your journey right now, similar to the journey I was on, this is something you'll hear a lot, and it becomes important to look at the difference between proof and evidence. The fact of the matter is, there is no proof for any worldview. There is no proof of Christianity. There is no proof of atheism. There is no proof of Buddhism. And that can be a little jarring to hear. And what I mean by that is, that doesn't mean there can't be tons of evidence for it. And we get these terms mixed up a lot of the time. You guys, you weren't born yet. Remember the Oj Simpson Trial? Have you read about the Oj Simpson Trial? Okay. Growing up, this was the biggest thing that had ever happened. Okay. And if you ask people universally now, even as much as you guys have read about it, it's just a universal fact that Oj Simpson's guilty, right? Oj Simpson totally killed those two people. Everybody knows that. There is zero proof that Oj Simpson killed anybody. There's a ton of evidence that he killed people. There's no proof. And that's a very important distinction to make. There's a lot of evidence for atheism. There's a lot of evidence for Buddhism. There's a lot of evidence for Hinduism. There's a lot of evidence for Christianity. But there's not definitive proof. And really, when you talk about looking at your worldview and judging it and breaking through those narratives, what you're talking about is weighing evidence. You're talking about doing the same thing that they do in a courtroom. Very few of the things that you believe or hold sacred to you, you have actual proof for. And that's okay. We've kind of adopted this thing in our culture that you shouldn't believe something unless it's been proven. And that's kind of a lie. There's very little that has definitive proof behind it, the way like a geometrical equation does. That's not how proof works. The vast majority of the things we believe or even hold true, even in the scientific realm, are based on evidence, not proof. So you look at the reality around you, and I think you get so used to what you're seeing that you start to take it for granted. You ever thought about the fact you have a hand? That's crazy. The fact that you have eyes, the fact that your eyes can process through a brain, the fact that there are chemicals in my brain triggering speech to you right now, and you can hear it through your ears, which have a hammer and an anvil and whatever else they got, and your brain is processing this stuff. It's ridiculous. It's almost like too hard to believe. You take it for granted because it happens every day, but when you really stop and separate yourself from the situation, it's mind-boggling. Like none of this should be here. I shouldn't be able to talk to you right now. I shouldn't be able to process this. The fact you're filming this is crazy. The fact we can make machines, the fact that we make cars, the fact that we can't even make machines that can do most of the stuff our bodies can do. I mean, the most brilliant minds in the world can't duplicate what our bodies can do and what nature does. It's insane. So is it crazy to believe that a omniscient, omnipotent God or intelligence hovers outside of all of it? Yeah, it's crazy. It's totally crazy. But is it equally crazy to think that if you let matter sit long enough that it will sprout legs and arms and start writing music and poetry? Yeah, that's insane. The fact of the matter is that the answers to these questions, the reality we see around us, is so crazy that the explanation for it is going to be equally crazy. And when I talk about the narrative of the unbiased, proven worldview, what I'm talking about is this notion that there is a very simple, rational explanation for all of it. There's not. There's no really rational explanation for any of it. I mean, and that's because the end result of this creation, or whatever you want to call it, is so mind-boggling that its source must also be mind-boggling. So just closing out here, I go to North Point Church, Andy Stanley's church. I don't know if any of you guys go to Buckhead, or you've probably heard of it at least. Andy's known for making brilliant points. And one of the points he made that always stuck with me was that a lot of times in life, when you're in a conflict with somebody, you've got two options. You can make a point or you can make a difference. You can choose to have a relationship with somebody, or you can choose to win an argument. And those are oftentimes, even if it's not fair, even if you're conceding a point that you shouldn't have to, even if you're totally in the right, you often find yourself in the position where you can either make a point or you can make a difference. And this relates back to apologetics because, one of the things I remember Pete McKenna taught me was that apologetics at its core is not about winning arguments. It's got nothing to do with that. And if you approach it from that viewpoint, you're really missing out what the purpose of it is. The point of apologetics is to build relationships and to connect with people and to really have some foundation upon which to wrestle with these questions with other people who are wrestling with them who may not agree with you. I've been in debates with many atheists where I have just burned them. I've been burned in just as many debates. And at the end of the day, nothing came from that. Arguments, shouting at me. I've been in these. I've been in multiple on both sides, winning and losing. And at the end of the day, none of it mattered. It wasn't the point. And even going into those conversations, I was missing the point by thinking that I was debating somebody based over nothing but facts. Because what I was really talking about was their narrative. I was talking about the worldview that they came into the conversation with. And I guess that's the one thing I want to leave you guys with, to consider that, to start thinking of that, because I think the approach to apologetics and Christianity and having conversations with people who agree with it is so much about, well, if I can make this point and prove them wrong, I've won. But you can't. There's no winning. It's not a winning-losing thing. It's a relational thing. That was the paradigm shift for me, at least. So wherever you are on your faith journey, I would just ask you to keep that in mind. Think that over, because for me, it was an incredibly freeing principle, and I hope it would be for you too. So that's all I got.
Questions? If you're up for answers.
Yeah, sure.
Well, you were talking earlier about like as a narrative, you might encounter several evidences for several accounts, but how do you account for the interpretation that you give to those evidences? Like, if let's put just a scientific example.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say there's a chemist in a room, and he knows how to, like phenolphthalein, changes color, whatever process it goes through. But there's a non-scientific person in the room, and he sees that this experiment is just being there. So how does that, the interpretations will vary according to their area of expertise.
They will, but I think perspective has a lot to do with that. I mean, in that situation, I'm probably more prone to want to hear what the scientist has to think of it, because the scientist understands the inner workings of it versus what is the field of study of the other person? Or does it matter? In your example, are you saying like, so they would see a chemical change color and then they would say, oh, well, there must be a fairy that caused that? Or is that what you're getting at? Like the idea of taking something scientific and having a non-scientific versus scientific explanation for it?
Well, also to the point of the disagreement, now you're pointing that the scientist will be stronger in its argument, in his arguments. But also, what if two scientists disagree strongly in a very different way? The same as a theologian, or like how can we reconcile all these arguments that probably the evidence is there, but the interpretation is the tough part too.
You're asking a really great question, and I don't, without going into some specific examples, it would probably be really hard to really come up with a definitive answer. And I'll tell you something that's a little uncomfortable too. You might not be able to come up with a definitive answer in some of these situations. There are a lot of things to look at in a situation like that. So right now there's this whole debate over, intelligent design, for example. That's the one that's kind of in the news lately. I've read books on both sides, and what's so interesting about it is I'm seeing people that are looking at the exact same group of facts coming up with completely different conclusions. And that's a tough thing. I mean, I don't think that the people on the atheist side who are arguing for naturalistic evolution are lying. I don't think it's like a conspiracy to get me to be an atheist. But at the same time, the people on the intelligent design side have really good points. I mean, there's really not a simple answer to your question. I wish I could give you one, but I often find myself trying to understand more about the person who's making the argument and what some of their other writings are. I'm less apt to believe something Richard Dawkins says, just because I've seen so many terrible arguments come from him. That doesn't mean he's wrong about certain things, right? I don't know. It's a very tricky question to answer, and I think you're asking a really good one. But I think even in those situations, it is very much a matter of looking at evidence. Oftentimes, you can have two people looking at the same piece of evidence, but then I ask the question, why are you going that direction and you're going the other direction? Like, when you stack it all up, what does it really lean towards? And even the interpretation of that can be tricky. They might say there's more evidence for this. I might say there's more evidence for this. What are we supposed to do? Keep a score? I don't know. It's a tricky question. I don't think I'm answering your question at all, but but I hope I don't know. Again, without going into some specific examples, I think it's a very hard thing to answer. But that's kind of how science works, isn't it? I mean, when you look at science over the years and over the long term, you have disagreements all the time. You have them right now. And ultimately what you start to see is over the long term, the things that are truer end up, things that were wrong 300 years ago, we don't still believe, right? I think a lot of the questions now, and again, this is a faith proposition, so I don't know if this will actually turn out being true. I think 100 years from now, we will have a very different perspective on the creation-evolution debate, because I think this stuff works itself out over time. I think that scientific questions like this start to get the weight of evidence behind them. I don't think most scientists, even if you look at the numbers on how many are religious and how many aren't, ultimately most scientists care about truth. I mean, most scientists, even if they are atheists, are not trying to prove atheism is true. They really care about what the facts and the evidence say, and I think over time that does bear itself out. So, I don't know if that answered your question at all, but a little bit? Okay. Yeah. Cool. Yes?
Just in your personal experience, I wanted to know what you thought it took to change someone's narrative. And like the follow-up to that is how productive are conversations like these?
Changing someone's narrative is very much a matter of identifying what it is. So, I've had conversations with people recently, actually, who were very troubled by the idea of Christianity because they hated the idea that if you're saying Christianity is true, you have to be saying other things are false. And so they rejected Christianity for that reason. Not seeing the irony in that in rejecting Christianity, they were therefore saying Christianity is also false. So, in a sense, they were doing exactly what they were afraid of doing, and in the process rejected Christianity because of it. It's a matter of learning how to think about these things and learning how to look behind a narrative and really understand where somebody's coming from. And I think a lot of the times what you have to do is get to know the person instead of the argument. And I think it becomes very much a matter, and this took me a really long time to do. This is something that, like a lot of Peter's writings, and teaching helped me with, was to, instead of look at the argument, look at the assumption behind the argument. And oftentimes somebody's assumption is based very much on that narrative. If somebody makes the comment that, well, all Christians hate gay people, well, I immediately want to know why they think that. Like, did they have a bad experience with certain Christians? Did they read that somewhere? It's very much a matter of where you direct your questions. And I think a lot of the times, a lot of these debates and discussions get so up in the trees and they're not focusing on the trunk, which is where the argument really is. As far as how productive conversations about narratives are, I've found they're very productive, because I think when you start to link an argument more with the person, it becomes more meaningful to them. I think they begin to open up more. I found that with myself. If an atheist really wants to get to know me and wants to understand why I really believe a thing, and they really want to probe how I grew up, where did I get these assumptions from? That's more meaningful to me. I'm more likely to have a very civil, friendly conversation with somebody over that, as opposed to somebody telling me you're an idiot because you don't believe that, birds came from dinosaurs or whatever. It becomes a much more personal conversation when you talk about narratives. It becomes a much more personal conversation when you talk about the basis and the assumptions for a worldview other than the in-game argument of it. So.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Hi.
Hey.
First, that was great.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was good. So I just want to address something that you said to Tyler just now.
Okay.
How you brought up how some atheists that you've known have seen Christianity and you're like, oh, I can't believe in that because it therefore implies that these things also stand, and I can't believe in those things, therefore Christianity is wrong.
Right.
In the same way, the only issue I had with your whole presentation is that atheism doesn't necessarily imply materialism. That atheism can also cover like some forms of deism and pantheism. That like it's not there's Christianity or you think that there's nothing immaterial.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and let me clarify that. I actually meant to say this at the end of the talk. So the reason I'm focusing so much on atheism is because that tends to be where the debate lies. You've probably talked to way more atheists or agnostics than you have Hindus. Maybe you haven't, maybe you're different, I don't know. That tends to be where, in the society we live in, that tends to be where the conflict is. I would disagree with you a little bit in saying that atheists can also be pantheists. I think those are very different worldviews. So the idea of atheists saying there is no God, the idea of pantheism being that we are gods. God is in us. God is the world.
So then it's secular.
Well, secularism is a little bit different from atheism, though, isn't it? You are. The way I've always looked at it, you essentially most every worldview boils down to one of three categories, and then there are a lot of subcategories of that. So you're right. You can't say all atheists are the same. You're absolutely right. I didn't mean to imply that. Most atheists tend to have a materialistic bent. I would say. Would you say that that's fair?
In my experience, that is true.
Really? Yeah. So you would say most atheists. How would you define most atheists?
For instance, in Scandinavia, most people are secular.
Mm-hmm.
But in your definition, they're not atheists to the extent that they still believe that there's something immaterial, like Spinoza's God,
mm-hmm.
for instance.
I would still call that a form of theism, though.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify.
I would say I'm yet to really encounter a worldview that doesn't fall into either the category of pantheism, atheism, or theism. And then there's agnosticism, which is kind of like the wild card. You're kind of not really sure what you believe, and you haven't really taken a position. But you're absolutely right. Atheism does not imply materialism.
One more thing.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah.
I remember. Okay, so I was also raised a young Earth creationist.
Yeah, it was great.
Totally thought that the Earth was 6,000 years old.
Yeah.
Fully convinced, but when I was looking over Genesis, like you were, and comparing it to evolution, I found that it's not necessarily in the right order per se. Which I definitely don't think that proves that if evolution is true, that therefore this is inconsistent, because I do think that creationism can go hand in hand with evolution, but I'm just saying that it's not in order.
Yeah, well, so I read a book about this, and if you have any interest in it, I'll let you borrow it, because I thought, yeah, my point in saying that is not I read a book, therefore I'm right and you're wrong. That's not what I'm saying. I read a book about this. It was actually written by a non-Christian. And I can't remember if he was a scientist or what it was, because I saw the same thing at first. And even in his book, there were some things I was kind of like, well, yeah, maybe, I don't, and I can't remember all the details of what. And my point in giving that analogy was not, oh, well, the Bible is talking about evolution. That's obvious. My point with that analogy was that in holding on to something so dearly, I may have been missing another confirming truth by holding on to that so dearly. I'm not even saying that's a perfect example of that. The point of it was really more the analogy of it as opposed to the... Now, I would love for you to read this book and tell me what you think of it, because you may have had some of the same issues with it that I did. But I think what you find remarkable in that story is that you do see a process. You do see a slow coming together of things. You do see a gradual increase in order, and things start to get more complicated and complex. The specific order of it, yeah, you may be right. I don't know. The book I read I found pretty convincing, but I still had some problems with it. There were probably some of the same things you saw. But the point I would go back to is namely that maybe these things aren't as at odds as I thought they were. And that's the only point I would get across with that.
We're on the same page.
Yeah.
No more questions.
Oh, okay.
You're on.
Anybody else? Yeah.
I have another question regarding your personal narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Like at some point, you may feel that while you're growing, you feel that you have a certainty on your beliefs. Like you're absolutely sure that creation was in 6,000 years or whatever. But then as you grow, your belief system changed, and so it continues with you along. So how do you define, or how do you see like a Christian who holds a belief now, and as time passes, he gets absolutely certain that he holds the truth already in this sense. So how? Let me rephrase my question. I don't know if
I think I see what you're getting at.
Yeah.
Keep going.
So the point is that I've talked to several Christians who have told me that I've experienced this and I think this is God, but at the same time now they don't act as Christians, and they don't trust in God in several ways and things like that. So I don't think that it's also like the foundation of Christianity as well. But how do you see the change of a worldview being a part of your belief system in your own narrative?
Part of what I think you're asking is how can you ever really know anything? Is that kind of part of what you're getting at? Well, I mean, I'll tell you this, like, to a certain extent, I don't know that everything I believe is true. I mean, all of us, like, the things that you believed 10 years ago are not necessarily the things you believe now, and are not necessarily the things you're going to believe in 10 years. That's the journey I'm on, man. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I could come back in 10 years and I'm an atheist. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. I feel like I've looked at the evidence closely enough that I'm very secure in my beliefs. But I'll tell you, I mean, even over the past 2 years, I've taken some major theological shifts on things that I looked at as sacred cows at one time. So my worldview is constantly changing and evolving. It is at the point now where I am so dissatisfied with the answers that come from other worldviews that I'm pretty much always in kind of the Christian sandbox. But where I am on that spectrum changes all the time. And I can't sit here and tell you that it's kind of like what we were talking about. It's like, I don't know that the Bible confirms evolution. I don't know. I look at the evidence and I think there's a lot of striking parallels there. But, you know, think it was the ancient Greeks, talked about how true wisdom comes from being willing to say that I don't know the right answer. And sometimes that's okay. Sometimes it's okay to not be 100% sure whether something's true. That's okay. We tend to get obsessive with constantly saying, no, we solved it, like it's a math equation. Like we have to always have something after that equal sign. And I think, for the major big questions of my life, I feel very confident, just based on my years of study and the things I've encountered and the things I've experienced, that I'm on the right track. But could that track change in 5 years? Sure, it totally could. So I don't know that you will ever get to a point where you know everything. And why would you expect to, really? I mean, when you think about it, it's like, if you are what am I trying to say here? Think about you compared to God. Think about, if the Christian God is true, you were talking about more knowledge than you can even begin to fathom. So why think that someone as limited in knowledge as we would be in that situation would be sure about everything? We wouldn't. I mean, this is the human journey. I mean, this is very much what we're doing. This is why we have universities. This is why we tug over these questions. This is why we pull over them. I don't know what your worldview is now. It could be totally different in 5 to 10 years. Mine could be. Mine has been. Mine's changed over and over and over again. Not as drastically as, I was an atheist and I was a Buddhist and I was a Hindu. But, even within that worldview, my views have changed. So I feel like every time you ask a question, I can do a really vague answer. It's probably not totally satisfying, but the nature of your questions are great. But that's what I would say to you. You don't know for sure. I think you can have enough confidence to make you comfortable. Like I'm very, despite talking about the idea that worldviews change, I'm very confident in the things I believe. But you could sit here and debate me right now. I mean, like again, the conversation you and I had, you may pull out the Bible and totally convince me that no, that wasn't talking about evolution. Totally different thing. Now, does that undercut my faith as a Christian? No, it doesn't at all. But the specifics of the things we believe as Christians, are always evolving. It's an ironic word to use with that. But, so, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
Would you say everyone thinks they're on the right track?
I would say that, no, I wouldn't say everyone thinks they're on the right track. I would say most people think they are. I would say that people who are truly looking at these questions very, very seriously, at least have a part of them that know that there's a possibility they're wrong. I think so. And again, I'm not trying to define anybody, that's not it at all, but I think that, and it doesn't even have to be as extreme as like, well, atheism could be true. Yeah, atheism could be true. I don't think it is. I have seen way too much to make me even consider that that's still a possibility. But yeah, it's possible I'm wrong. It's possible we're wrong. But I also have enough faith and belief in the things that I've studied and seen. It would take a mountain of evidence to convince me that Christianity is not true. Just the path I've gone on and the things I've experienced personally, and you may or may not have been there, I don't know. And I could talk about, various fields of evidence, but even in personal situations, spiritual experiences I've had, which I know people don't put a lot of stock in. You're not supposed to talk about apologetics things, but those things matter. These are emotional experiences. We're spiritual creatures, if you believe that, and so spiritual experiences matter. So yeah, to a certain extent, I think most people do think they're on the right track. I think another thing, though, is that I think a lot of people just don't care. That's the one that's always kind of blown my mind. And that was the thing that always kind of drove me crazy when I was, having these conversations with people. A number of people were like, yeah, I don't know. Like they were more concerned with what they were going to have for dinner that night than how we got here. And I was like, what? Like that blew my mind. It's like this is the greatest mystery in the universe. Like I got to know what's going on here. I got to know how that body got in the street. And they're just kind of walking over it on the way to the next tea party, And that always drove me crazy. So I think what you will see is a higher instance of people that are just totally apathetic to the question. My guess is that everybody in this room is here because you're not satisfied with that. You're not satisfied with stepping over the body. You need to know how I got there. And these are the questions I've chewed over since I was 16, 17, 18, and I imagine most of you guys have too. I think that's what draws us to this type of discussion, this field of study, these types of difficult brain food to chew on. So, yeah.
Cool.
Well, thanks, guys. I appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
I hope that didn't suck.
No.
Actually reminds me of a post I saw a couple days ago where it's basically someone said they were basically talking about how no one will ever, no one really will question their worldview. We all want some simple answer, but reality is so nuanced and complicated that few people ever actually look at the evidence.
Well, yeah, and I think it's.
I'm paraphrasing. It's a long post.
No, I'm sure it's more complicated than that. But yeah, I think that the more troubling thing, and I guess kind of the point I was trying to get with this talk, is the number of times we reach conclusions for not great reasons. There is so much to it, and it does require so much thought. I think a lot of people just kind of don't feel like putting the work into it, or they just don't care about the question. Which, I don't know what you do with that. I don't know how you convince somebody that they should care whether Jesus died and rose again, or whether there's not a God, or I don't know. That's always been the one I've had the hardest time with. Is I don't know. I've never quite been able to wrap my head around that. But
I can definitely see that. I mean, I could try and convince all of you how important it is to try and study the wreck sites of World War II warships, but most of y'all aren't going to care.
right.
And how important it is to determine exactly how they sank. None of y'all care. But for me, that's something that's exciting.
Right.
And I enjoy doing that. But if you just don't care, you just don't care.
Yeah, I can't explain to my girlfriend why Star Wars is awesome. She's not going to get it. There's no way.
That's awful.
It's just awesome.
It's all that she doesn't.
Oh.
Oh yeah.
Tragic. Yeah.
I mean, there's just you can't. But see, to me, I mean, and that's a silly example. I mean, because Star Wars doesn't impact everybody. The questions we're talking about are things that something caused this. We got here somehow. We got to this point in history and this point in space-time through a series of events, and I want to know what those events were. And and I may never have all the answers, at least not in this life, but damn if I'm not going to research and come to some sort of satisfactory conclusion that I'm happy with. So, well, thanks guys. I really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, definitely.